We on Fire Sports Podcast, the spot, season number 4, season finale, episode number 65. And yeah, man, welcome in. We on Fire Sports Podcast, the spot. Your lovely host T-Knot in the building. And yeah, this is the season 4 finale, man. It's been a crazy sports, season, so far, man. Those first and foremost, man, for your first time listening, we on Fire Sports Podcast, the spot. We provide hot fire takes and analysis across the sport landscape. And if you're OG of the show, man, you know what to do. I appreciate you once again checking in. And yeah, man, we rolling on along, man. Episode number 65 is the final episode of season number 4. We've been rolling this thing, man, since August, since the beginning of pretty much the NFL preseason, all the way through, man, through the NBA Finals. Is now we're in the lovely month of July. We got off of the 4th of July, a little kick. Everybody, enjoyed themselves, hopefully. Hope everybody was, safe and, man, just being able to sit back and enjoy either family or friends, man, and hang out and do your thing. Now we're in the mid-swing, man, in the middle of the summer pretty much, man, and just young July. And things are heating up, even across the sporting landscape. As, like I said, the NBA season is concluded. Obviously, Oklahoma City Thunder won the NBA championship this season. And the reason I want to congratulate Oklahoma City as well as young Jalen Williams, man, getting that big-time extension from the Oklahoma City Thunder that just came down the pipeline today. Obviously, Chet Holmgren got broke off, yesterday, man, with a nice little bag himself. Big-time extension for him. Both of these gentlemen in the 200 club. And now, Oklahoma City, they just in a position now to where, they just better hope those guys, one, first and foremost, remain healthy and give them an opportunity to win multiple NBA championships, man, over this nice little run. Obviously, all three gentlemen are young guys, and they finally gelled, last season and won an NBA championship, and the sky's the limit. Sam Presti finally got off the hump, won an NBA championship as the general manager. He had this whole little situation, back, in the KD, Westbrook, and Harden days, got them to the NBA Finals, but they fell short to the Miami Heat. And so this iteration of the Oklahoma City Thunder was able to get over the hump, man. So definitely in the NBA, the still signings jumping off. Obviously, we had the little frenzy as far as what you can consider free agency, via also 2 trades. There was a lot of movement across the league, man, and definitely on this season finale, we're going to get into that, tooth and nail. It's been a lot of interesting things, I've seen as the NBA has transitioned now to the Summer League. You get a chance to see these young draftees, first and foremost on that landscape, it's going to be Cooper Flagg, first and overall pick of the Dallas Mavericks, making his debut, man, coming up. We're going to get into, just that whole situation with him and what I feel, as far as Dallas and what they can do next season. You had Kevin Durant going down to Houston. That was a big-time move for the Houston Rockets, and they just been building off of that. Ime Udoka getting broke off with that big-time extension. This is a team that finished second in the West last season, fell up short in the playoffs to the Golden State Warriors, and now you bring in, easy money sniper. You really didn't have to give up a lot of, your players to be able to bring Kevin Durant into the fold. And now you put yourself in contender territory. Van Fleet, they extended him. They made, some other big time, key little moves as far as maintaining, just the culture with Ume down there. And also, too, bringing in a guy, which Kevin Durant, man, is really low maintenance from a standpoint. He just want to go out there and hoop. And so I'm liking what I'm seeing in Houston. Like I said, I think they've put themselves up in the high tier as far as a legitimate championship contender. We got to see how this thing pan out, though, man. We've seen a lot of teams over the last couple of years on paper, whether it was Kevin Durant up in Brooklyn with him and James Harden and Kyrie Irving. That looked like on paper that they was going to get to the NBA Finals. Never happened. You've seen the situation Kevin Durant just got out of in Phoenix, with Devin Booker and Bradley Beal. Didn't get a chip out of it. And so now, this is really kind of the third swing for Kevin Durant. And I'm a KD fan. I just enjoy watching KD play, man, going out there. Like I said, he low maintenance. He just a guy that just want to go out there, man, and hoop. And obviously compete, try to win some basketball games. But that hadn't been the case over the last couple of years. The situation in Phoenix was a crash and burn. I mean, when you look at it and you just kind of see what has unfolded over the last couple of years with the organization, you bring in Matt Ishbia, the owner of the Phoenix Suns, and the first thing he do is, trade for KD. Then, let me get Bradley Beal too. Let me double up on that, and it set their organization back. And they're in a real situation in Phoenix. Congratulations to Devin Booker, signed a 2-year extension. He was already, basically had 3 years remaining. They gave him an additional 2 years, which by average salary, the highest paid player in the NBA right now. And so, when I saw that, because to my OGs, those who know, I've said this before. I think the Phoenix Suns should trade Devin Booker. I mean, there's no reason to really have Devin Booker unless you're trying to sell tickets. The team is going nowhere. I mean, they're going nowhere fast. I mean, it's the Western Conference. Ain't no wishing upon a star when you talk about the Western Conference and just how competitive it is. And Devin Booker over the last couple of years has proven that, he can give you some numbers, but they haven't really equated to wins. Now, he has made the NBA Finals with the Phoenix Suns, a few years back. But, ever since that time period, he's just been kind of just out there hooping. And to me, if you Phoenix, especially with the second aprons and all of these, cap situations that we see going on in the NBA, it's not a fruitful situation for you to extend a guy and you have no direction. And let's just play the hypothetical game for a minute. Let's just say, a few months into the NBA season, Devin Booker get me up out of here. Now, you've added that additional money on the back end. It's going to be hard to trade this guy as far as you being able to get some kind of, good value back because the man's salary. You just put yourself and box yourself in. If you was going to trade him, you might as well just went ahead and got rid of him now. The man got 3 years remaining on this deal. And then I hear the word on the street is that the Phoenix Suns is going to try to, stretch wave Bradley Beal. And so I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, okay, you basically on average you're giving Devin Booker about $70 million a pop, once it kind of averages itself out. And you telling me you're gonna stretch a guy for 5 years in Bradley Beal or whatever, and however much $1 million of that is dead cap. And so now the functionality of your team has been compromised just based on these two, to me, idiotic moves. Sometimes you got to, what they say, know when to hold them, know when to fold them. Dude, you're in the Western Conference. You're not going to win or be competitive next season. So why should you pay a guy a premium? You might as well get as much as you want to get for him and then just be able to simply rebuild it back. I mean, you got Jalen Green in the fold who came over in the Houston Rocket deal. He's 23 years old. Just go ahead and rebuild it around Jalen Green. But no, they make these idiotic moves and, for every, team making bad moves, there's teams out here, making legitimate moves. So I'm not going to rain on the whole parade. But, over this whole free agency period of what we've seen so far across the NBA, there's definitely been some winners and losers. I like what Denver did. Denver Nuggets traded Michael Porter Jr., shipped him to Brooklyn, brought in, Cam Johnson. And so I just think that for me, it was a smart move by them from a standpoint of you get a 3-and-D guy, a guy that can be able to defend, be able to, shoot the rock, could play, with Jokic. Now, Michael Porter Jr. is a more talented player. It just seemed like he hit a wall. Obviously, he was nicked up a little bit. But it just didn't work out for Michael Porter Jr. And, to me, for the Denver Nuggets, they brought also back Bruce Brown into the fold. He won a championship with the Nuggets a couple years ago. He was just that junkyard dog for the Denver Nuggets. I thought that was a very intelligent move by Denver to be able to do that. And they got new GMs up there. I think they got 2 GMs right now presently in Denver. So, they was able to kind of, get, and hit the ground running as far as being able to kind of, change this roster a little bit. And still going to be in a situation for them as far as health and, Jamal Murray, how good, he plays next season with this new iteration of the Denver Nuggets. They re-signed, traded for Jonas Valanciunas, but he's in a situation where he kind of going back and forth with whether or not he want to go overseas. But I think that if they do bring in Jonas Valanciunas, I think that this team is now deep in the front court position. And I think that they're a better probably team going into next season as they were this season. Obviously they, fired Mike Malone in that whole process, but I think next season could be a better showing for him. We'll just see. In the West, I mean, it just simply boils down to the matchups in the West. We all know what that do. And so, that's a quick little peek, man, just across the NBA as far as what I've seen just over just, the whole movement and trades and free agency. And we're going to dive a little bit more into it as well, man, on this episode. Once again, it's the season finale, episode number 4, season number 4, episode number 65. That's how long we've been out here trugging along, man, since August all the way now to the summertime, man. So once again, man, I appreciate all the love and the feedback. I appreciate your ear. Coming up the rest of the show, We on Fire Sports Podcast. The Spot. Welcome back. And last night we had NBA Summer League jumping off on ESPN, the Vegas edition of NBA Summer League. We had the California Classic, a little taste of that in California style with the Summer League jumping off, the Warriors and Lakers and so forth. But last night was the showcase, with Cooper Flagg, #1 overall pick, NBA draft by the Dallas Mavericks. And we also, too, got the polarizing Bronny James in the building for the Los Angeles Lakers. And, we've had a bunch of things jump off, obviously, over NBA free agency and just the end of the season and so forth. And, big-time move for the Oklahoma City Thunder, obviously signing, they big three as they try to repeat. But teams and that clock starts back at square one since the season is over with. And before I get into that, I definitely, as I mentioned earlier, it's the season finale of season number 4. And I want to shout out, man, all my contributors that came through, man, all my correspondents that came through over the season. We rolled this thing out in August, right before the NFL season. And I got to shout out, man, my NFL correspondent, man, Dolphin correspondent, my man Steve, man, falling throughout the season, man, providing great analysis, man, in the National Football League. Also to his home team, the Miami Dolphins. So definitely I appreciate you for falling through, man. Adding that sauce on to the program. Much appreciated. Also, I got to thank my fellas, man. My fellas over there at the Weekly Dog Sports Betting Podcast. My man, Mako Scott, the Mad Russian, and Isalim, Mr. Taylor Street. You can catch them boys at Firebox 2300, man, on YouTube. Also, too, on Spreaker, man. They came through all season long, both on the NFL side, NBA side as well. Providing good analysis, man, across the sporting landscape. So I appreciate you, bros. But the NBA and, Summer League is always, to me, a good little swing dig, man, as we just got out of the NBA draft, end of the NBA season. And Cooper Flagg, #1 overall pick, from Duke. This is a young man that won Player of the Year award in the NCAA. Duke fell short, winning the national championship this year. But Cooper Flagg goes into what most would consider a pretty good situation down there in Dallas. A few months back, man, they had to, increase their security detail for Mr. Nico Harrison, the general manager of the Dallas Mavericks. And, they lucked up and won the lottery and ended up getting Cooper Flagg. So it was his debut officially as an NBA player. Also, you had Bronny James, man. Bronny James is just a long legacy, long story. With him all season long. And those who are OG of the show already know, how I felt about that situation with Bronny James when he got drafted. I just thought that, the Lakers, did, your boy LeBron James a solid. I just thought that, at that time he wasn't a ready, NBA player. It wasn't a knock against the young man. I just thought that, he just wasn't ready, but he has the potential to be an NBA player. Go down to the G League and work on your game. And that's what he's done. And so last night it was a good little showcase. Got an opportunity to check it out, watch the entire game. And, Cooper Flagg, came out, looking like an 18-year-old. This is a step up, from the ACC and from college basketball. And, he's going to learn and take his lumps, but I think it was a good experience for him overall. He put up a lot of shots. He wasn't really, efficient from the field, but he showed, some good plays out there, showed some good hustle out there. Dallas had him bringing the ball down. There's a lot of people saying that, hey, he's going to be kind of a ball handler for this team. And, I just think that at the end of the day, he still got to develop his skill in that, because there's dogs in the NBA. Guys who are very athletic or who will pressure up on him, and if he ain't really got, taps and got handles like that, he gonna get exposed. So, I think that the Dallas Mavericks, obviously with Kyrie Irving being injured, and just, them kind of getting their team all the way back together, they definitely got a puncher's chance in the West this season. But we don't know with Kyrie Irving. You brought in D'Angelo Russell. He's a good little stopgap guard. D'Lo, things didn't go well, man, once he went back out to Brooklyn for the second time. So this gives him an opportunity to get some of that get back, get his career back on, the proper perch. And so, we'll see. But in the game on the Lakers side, Bronny James went out there, man. Looks like he was a little bit more confident than what we've seen him in the past. Played maybe about a good half the game or so forth. And, the Lakers, they in a situation, bringing in DeAndre Ayton, over, with the whole him getting waived from the Phoenix Suns. And, I thought it was a proper move for the Los Angeles Lakers. I mean, they had nothing in the front court last season, and your best two players are the worst two defenders on your team. And there's no shot at LeBron James and Luka Doncic, but we all know defense is not their specialty. And so, for me, they got to get better defensively. I think they do that with DeAndre Ayton. I think that, they have to make a few other moves to try to get this team kind of more well-rounded. And, they had the whole ownership change with Jeannie Buss, selling the team. And so they're in a new atmosphere in Los Angeles. To throw on top of that, you had, LeBron James and the Los Angeles Lakers not, negotiating past, this season coming up for LeBron James. And a lot of people believe that this might be a swan song for LeBron James. I don't know. That could be very possible. At the end of the day, when guys do retire, it's their decision. And, he's had a great career, Hall of Fame career. I'm not going to throw no dirt on him, even though, I've had some issues with him in the past, and I've gotten that across on this respective podcast. I just don't feel he's the greatest player of all time. I think that, obviously MJ is the greatest player of all time. But outside of that, the man has had a good career. He's won some championships. And so the Lakers, it's Luka Doncic's team now. And you put the team in the hands of a guy that, his former team, who is a franchise player and a rock star down in Dallas, they didn't want to break bread with him. And, they had a new ownership situation going on. So it's going to be intriguing what we see, out of Los Angeles, coming up, for the regular season. It may well indeed, be LeBron James' final season as an NBA player. Also, there were some other moves, since we're talking to Los Angeles Lakers, I guess I'll bring the Boston Celtics into this equation. We all had the injury with Jason Tatum going down with the Achilles injury. And this team, man, they hit the seller's market faster than anybody doing, the whole free agency, and right after the season, trading, Holiday, shipping him out to Portland, then getting rid of Kristaps Porzingis, sending him down to the Atlanta Hawks. And so this team got to selling off some of them pieces. And, they brought in Anthony Simons, who I think is a scorer. I think he's able to shoot the rock for him. I think he put up, a lot of points out there, what we used to call back in the day empty calories out there in Portland. So we'll see if he's able to, be still fruitful offensively in an organization and a team that, at some point want to get that bounce back. And, next season for Boston looks like it's going to be a bridge year. Al Horford don't look like he's coming back to the Boston Celtics. Mr. Benjamin Button himself. And so, there's some teams, have made some moves, in the Eastern Conference, which a lot of people feel that the Eastern Conference is wide open. I believe that as well. You've seen just Tyrese Halliburton go down in the NBA Finals with an Achilles injury. Then you had the situation with Miles Turner jumping ship and going over to the enemy because he felt like the Indiana Pacers lowballed him. And for me, it's a tricky situation, meaning that if I'm the Indiana Pacers, I'm going ahead and break bread with Miles Turner, and here's the reason why. You got, the defender now NBA champion Oklahoma City Thunder. They just broke bread, and they're now in a situation where they're not a cheap, inexpensive team anymore. And, you got a guy like Isaiah Hardenstein over there making $27 million a year. And Miles Turner, was basically his deal with the Milwaukee Bucks was a little less than that. So, for me, the Indiana Pacers, I think they should have just went ahead and broke bread with them. But, they moved on, and now they go from a team that was a half away from winning an NBA championship to back to the middle of the pack. Also in the East, you had the Orlando Magic, going ahead and making that trade for Desmond Bane for the Memphis Grizzlies. They wanted to, increase their shooting. They was one of the worst shooting teams over the regular season last year. On top of that, Jamal Mosley, head coach of the Orlando Magic, had to deal with some injuries. And congratulations to Paulo Banchero signing that huge deal, cool, right under $300 million. I think he's a very young, exciting player, man. I'm definitely a fan of his game. And I thought that Orlando, if they didn't have, those injuries, they would have been in a better position in the East. So, they could be a team next season that go from, kind of the middle of the pack to being top tier in the East. So it is wide open. I think it's, a lot of people say it's the New York Knicks to lose. They just made a, head coach and hiring, bringing in Mike Brown. And Mike Brown, this is the guy, man, I guess, Mike Brown be the gift that keep on giving, man. Whoever Mike Brown agent is, man, they need to get a raise. Because it seems like Mike Brown always simmers around. He's like the best third option guy that you can have in the league. Good coach, you'll win some games. You'll be able to, get yourself into the playoffs. But he hadn't really proved that he can get a team, to that next level. And, you had a New York Knicks team last season that, lost to a team, the Indiana Pacers, that was a half away from winning the championship. So it wasn't all bad for the Knicks. They hadn't been to the Eastern Conference Finals in 25 years. And the Knicks, they move on from Tom Thibodeau. And now, you got a team that the pressure is high in New York. And Mike Brown is a guy that when we seen him in pressure situations or high-profile jobs such as the Los Angeles Lakers and the Cleveland Cavaliers with LeBron James, it didn't work out too well for him and he ended up getting fired. So the East, wide open. And as we speak and talk about the East, I got to bring it to the home team, man. I got to talk about my Chicago Bulls. This is an organization that, I've been frustrated over the past 4 years. I just think that we're in a situation where we're happy with mediocrity. And, Billy Donovan, the head coach of the Chicago Bulls, he's a good head coach. Billy D, man, did a great job, in his situation down at the University of Florida, winning 2 national championships. And, remember he was at, Providence, just before, I'm sorry, not Providence, but Marshall, played at Providence, back in the day. So, I don't think it's a Billy Donovan issue. I just think that, the general management in the front office of the Chicago Bulls, Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley, I think they got baby nuts. They going to Vegas or going to the slot machine to try to gamble, with $10. Good luck with that. And so I think that the Bulls, just what they're facing right now, they're not an active player in any kind of really realistic trades. They're not a player really in free agency, and we got the situation with Jonathan Kuminga, which word on the street is that the Bulls have some interest in Jonathan Kuminga. And to me, I'm like, man, look, he's a good young player, but, we're not going to be in a situation where you put your organization in a situation where you're overpaying for a guy. And that's the wrong thing to do in this league. We've seen teams over the last couple of years, that situation not work out for them. And I shift gears back to out west. And the first team that comes to mind in that situation is the Phoenix Suns. The Phoenix Suns, traded Kevin Durant, shipped him down to Houston, as they was able to get back in the fold, Jalen Green and, some draft picks, I believe 4 in total. And they shifted gears from that to giving an extension to Devin Booker. Now, mind you, Devin Booker still has 3 years left on his deal. And, I got hot about it earlier. I just think it's a situation, with the Phoenix Suns to where they hustling backwards. Especially if they stretch Bradley Beal. Not a good idea. Why would you stretch a guy when your team ain't finna do nothing but win about 30 games? You might as well go ahead and pay him. Let him play for your organization. And then when he get in the final year of his deal, go ahead and ship the man out of there. Expiring contract. And so Matt Ishbia, don't understand what's going on there. You got the situation with the Houston Rockets. Getting in, bringing in KD. Extending Ume Udoka. Re-signing and re-upping Fred VanVleet. And so I like the direction that the Houston Rockets is going. This team got the 2nd seed last season in the Western Conference. And they flamed out in the playoffs. Lost to a more experienced team and probably not one of their most talented teams in the Golden State Warriors. And now I just think that the movement that the Houston Rockets has made and the general manager Rafael Stone down there, they've gotten themselves now legitimately in the top of tier in the West. And they're definitely a threat to the Oklahoma City Thunder, but it's all about chemistry. We've seen, as I mentioned, KD moving down there. We've seen him move multiple times. It's his third really stop. As far as, hey, I'm finna go somewhere and, try to win a championship. And, Kevin Durant's not spring chicken anymore. So, this Houston thing, man, I like what they doing. I like how they cooking down there. I see what they own. And so they're definitely going to be a contender in the Western Conference. Denver, this is a team that had to move on from Michael Porter Jr., which to me was surprising. It was surprising because it's not the talent of Michael Porter Jr. It was just boiled down to just simply the injuries and him not being able to perform when he was on the court at the level he played at when they won an NBA championship. So, definitely Denver's, made a little move, brought in, Cam from the Brooklyn Nets. And I think he's a 3-and-D guy. Shot the rock well, averaged 18 points a game last season for the Brooklyn Nets. So I like that move, for the Denver Nuggets, and also to bringing my main man back into the fold, Bruce Brown. So this thing, man, has really been kind of topsy-turvy, man. It's good movement by a lot of teams across the National Basketball Association to try to get themselves up into the upper crust, give them a legitimate shot of winning an NBA championship. As before we get out of here, we got to touch the National Football League a little bit, man, before, camp's about to get into active mode in another week or so. So we're going to just talk a little bit of the National Football League, man, as this is the season finale of season number 4. Also, too, we're going to give a quick recap, man, of the year. As I mentioned, we jumped this thing off in August from the fall up into present up in July, man. Just the teams that won championships. The Philadelphia Eagles winning the Super Bowl, knocking off the Kansas City Chiefs. We're just going to rewind this thing back a little bit, man. Recap season number 4, man, before we get out of here, man. But first and foremost, I appreciate all the love and the feedback. I appreciate your ear. We on Fire Sports Podcast. The spot. Major League Baseball All-Star Game, man, coming up in Atlanta, down in Atlanta at Truist Park. Got an opportunity, man, to visit Truist Park last week during the holiday situation, holiday weekend. Tried to get out and enjoy some good, lovely baseball. And, summertime, man, baseball is marquee. Obviously it's a sport that's not, what I call in a major lexicon across the sporting landscape as far as the populace is concerned. I mean, we all know the National Football League is king, and, the NBA, even though the ratings is down, they're a better perch and a better situation than Major League Baseball. But, this season to me, man, I'm a baseball head, so I definitely follow Major League Baseball. Love to go out, man, to the park, man, watch a good game of baseball, man, have a couple beers, kick it, and enjoy just the sights and sounds around the ballpark. But, I think this season, man, so far, man, especially in the National League, you got my Cubs, man, right now leading the NL Central, man, 2 games up on the Milwaukee Brewers. The Brewers been playing some good baseball, man, over the last week. They done won, about 4 in a row. So they definitely on my Cubs' heels. You got the Mets, they've been playing pretty consistent baseball all season long, man, leading the NL East. They've been doing a good job. And, it's a team that, at the start of the season, they brought in Juan Soto. And, he started off a little slow. And, Cohen, one of the richest owners in Major League Baseball, it's a situation to where, he wanted to get that payroll at the same level as a team like the Los Angeles Dodgers. And so far for the New York Mets, it's worked out, for them. And speaking of the Los Angeles Dodgers, as we travel to the NL West, the NL West, man, when we had, at the start of the season, probably maybe about the first month or so in, I thought it was just going to go down, to the wire. It's still kind of one of those situations. I mean, the Dodgers, they're in first place, about good 5 games up on the Giants and the Padres. And, I think that the Dodgers, a lot of people thought coming into the season with the highest payroll in Major League Baseball is that they was on pace to probably win 105 and 110 games. And so looks like it's not going to be the case this season as far as the game total, but looks like they're in a good, situation to win the National League West. And so, yeah, man, baseball's heating up. I just, like I said, enjoy just all the festivities and the hoopla around Major League Baseball in the summertime as, the other sports take that ceremonious break. And we gonna transition to the National Football League. To the National Football League, man. The NFL right now, as I mentioned, man, they're about a week away from camps. You know, everybody is on equal footing. You know, I definitely got to talk about my Bears first and foremost, man. It's a big season for us. Bringing in Ben Johnson, you know, I thought that was the right move for the Chicago Bears. You know, I thought you got to bring in an offensive-minded guy, you know, especially when you pair him up, you know, with Caleb Williams, you know, #1 overall pick, you know, in his rookie season last year. You know, I thought a lot of people, you know, railed on him. You know, I thought, you know, when you look at it, you know, the other rookie, you know, Jaden Daniels, you know, once Jaden Daniels and the, you know, Washington Commanders, you know, got hot, yeah, you know, it put a target on Caleb Williams back from the scrutiny standpoint. But I think when you look at him statistically and you look at what he was able to do last season, it's not a bad year for a rookie. You know, I think right now we all expect rookies to go out there and throw for 4,500 yards and 35 touchdowns in their rookie season, and that's not the case all the time. You know, I thought that, you know, our offensive line and offensive coordinator was straight trash. You know, as we moved on, you know, made some, you know, key additions in the offseason on the offensive line. And so I think the Bears is in a better perch right now. And I think it's the most talent that we done had, man, probably in about 20 or so years. So, you know, the light is bright, man, up in Chicago. We got to figure out that whole stadium situation up there. But other than that, man, I think things are bright. You know, as the NFC North is definitely going to be locked and loaded. You got the Detroit Lions. You know, they had a good season last year, even though they fell off in the playoffs. You know, Dan Campbell, you know, a guy that, you know, eats nails for breakfast. You know, he got to replace a couple, you know, head coordinators, you know, up there in Detroit. But I think they may be, at least at minimum, still a playoff team. And so, and then you got the Green Bay Packers. You know, I got to mention them as well. You know, Jordan Love, you know, had, to me, an up and down season. You know, started off, you know, was looking good. But, you know, the Packers, man, is just that young receiving core. They got a lot of young guys up there in Green Bay. You know, they just really didn't get, you know, just that chemistry to kind of get them deeper in the playoffs than what they would wish. You know, you got the Minnesota Vikings and J.J. McCarthy, you know, him coming into the fold, you know, him getting that newly minted job. And so, you know, things are interesting in the NFC North, also, too, in the AFC North. What I consider the division of quarterbacks, you know, you got now Aaron Rodgers, you know, going up there to the AFC North. You got, you know, Lamar Jackson, obviously. You got Joe Burrow. And so, man, that North ain't no joke. And it's always been. You know, Cleveland, they still trying to figure out their quarterback situation. You know, they're a long ways away. You know, you got Shedeur Sanders, you know, most likely will probably win that job up there in Cleveland. So the North is going to be interesting. You know, obviously the Philadelphia Eagles winning the Super Bowl. You know, they're going to be back locked and loaded again. You know, let's see if they're hungry enough to try to repeat, which is a difficult thing to do in the National Football League. We've seen the Kansas City Chiefs do it most recently, but it's still a hard task in the NFL. And so, yeah, the National Football League right now is, you know, that period right before training camps, man, and teams are having high hopes of what they're able to do for the regular season coming up. So we'll see what that thing do. But finally, man, before we get out of here, we're going to go ahead and recap, man, season number 4 in just a year, man, as we started this thing off in August, beginning of the National Football League season, and we'll start there. You know, it was an interesting season, man. A lot of people thought, you know, Kansas City Chiefs, they was going on for the repeat. They was winning ugly. You know, there was a lot of, you know, ugliness to they winning, but they showed the heart of a champion during the regular season. You know, the playoffs, it was interesting, especially in the AFC, as, you know, the Baltimore Ravens, they fell up short in the playoffs. A lot of people thought, you know, that they was, you know, in the position to try to get to the Super Bowl. Them as well as the Buffalo Bills, as they fell up short again to the Kansas City Chiefs. You know, it was interesting, you know, a team like the Bengals, one of the most high-scoring teams in the league, didn't even make the playoffs. Just a lot of interesting things. Just the moves by the Washington Commanders and Dan Quinn up there, and Jaden Daniels, and the outstanding season that he had as a rookie, you know, getting them on the doorstep of getting to a Super Bowl. And so, this thing was, you know, very, very interesting over the last National Football League season. But, you know, the Philadelphia Eagles, you know, making that big-time move and putting the cherry on top with Saquon Barkley, it was just too much, man, for the Kansas City Chiefs. You know, as you know, they were a team that, you know, got exposed on the offensive end due to a lack of talent. You know, it's only so much that a Patrick Mahomes can do when you look at the front seven of the Philadelphia Eagles and them being able to rotate guys in and out of there. You know, it's going to be a long day. And so we saw that. And so now, you know, the Philadelphia Eagles are officially the king of the mountain in the National Football League. And congrats to them. And we had an interesting NCAA tournament. Congratulations to the Florida Gators. Walter Clayton Jr. had an outstanding tournament run. Shout out as well to the Houston Cougars, man, that made a very, very exciting championship game. I predicted the Houston Cougars to win the national championship and came oh so close with Kevin Sampson. But I thought, college basketball, you brought in, Cooper Flagg and Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey, and all these gentlemen are presently right now in Summer League competing, trying to, get their weight up. So it was a good year overall. Can't forget about college football. The Ohio State Buckeyes, man, Ryan Day winning the national championship. There's a lot of people that felt like, hey, his job was on the line, losing to Michigan. He was able to come back and scoop up that loose change, another national championship up there in Columbus. Right now the college football landscape is just like the Wild Wild West. Name, image, and likeness and transfer rules, and the NCAA trying to kind of figure that whole thing out. So we'll see what things do coming up into the next college football season as we return in season number 5, basically right on the heels of the beginning of the college football season. I'm going to have my correspondence falling through on that tip. And so, yeah, this thing has been very, very interesting, man, over the last, year or so. We recapped it with the Oklahoma City Thunder winning the NBA championship. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander winning league MVP, leading the league in scoring, NBA Finals MVP. Congratulations also to the head coach, Mark Daigneault. Young coach, with a bunch of young players, man. A lot of people thought they was too young to win an NBA championship, and they proved everybody wrong, man. So congratulations to the Oklahoma City Thunder as well as Sam Presti. Finally get off that hump and winning his first NBA championship as a general manager. And yeah, this thing is wild. I obviously can't forget about my people out there in California. I can't forget about the Los Angeles Dodgers winning the World Series last year. Mookie Betts and Freddie Freeman and seeing Ice Cube in that 6-4, man, with the trophy, man, that opening day this year, man, was a sight to see, man. So congratulations, obviously, to the Dodgers winning that chip last year. We'll see what they do this season. So yeah, man, thanks again, man, for everybody showing all the love, man, and the feedback and just positive vibes, man, across all people just out there listening to the podcast, not only in the United States but also too in other countries. Appreciate the love, man. We're gonna try to upgrade this thing in season number 5 with more guests. Also too, we're gonna add the video component to the whole scape. So know you guys are waiting on that as well, man. So I appreciate y'all, man. I love y'all. I hope the rest of the summer is definitely fruitful for you. Hope you enjoy yourself, man. Stay out of trouble. And we'll be back in this thing cracking once again, man, in August. Once again, I appreciate all the love and the feedback. I appreciate you. Yeah. We on fire. Sports Podcast, The Spot.